So I wanted to include a work like this in my medical ethics class because there's a lot of different ways that you can potentially teach medical ethics. And I've tried to, make my reading selections ones that are useful for nursing students or pre-med students, public health students, but also just useful to everyday people trying to understand health. Okay. And one of the, I guess, strange things about health, or strange things maybe even about academics or certain analyses, is that very often whenever we're trying to understand things, we think maybe at the wrong level. Okay. And what I mean by that is whenever we're trying to think about health, one of the motifs that this work especially covers is, yeah, sure, individual stuff matters, right? We can measure, for example, a patient's blood pressure or their blood sugar level, or any number of measurable things. But just as important, whenever we're considering what health is or how to positively impact it, we should look at social factors. Okay? And generally, this is what Jonathan Metzl is doing, who is a doctor and a professor. And he makes a really, exhaustive case for why social factors have really detrimental effects. And he says, look, the title of his book obviously is Dying of Whiteness. It's on the screen. It was in the syllabus, etc. And he says, I'm not trying to say that ill effects are constrained to white people or that we should solely focus on white people. He's like, look, there's already a lot of well-established research about the ways in which certain racial and ethnic minorities face discrimination and face negative health outcomes. So, for example, black women compared to white women, I think, are something like 2 to 3 times more likely to die of pregnancy-related illnesses. Okay? Women in general, as compared to men, have their pain reports believed less by doctors and are given way less pain medication or medical interventions. So a lot of this kind of stuff has been documented very, very thoroughly. And it shows the ways in which, medical systems and the ways that we practice medicine are biased against black people or brown people or various other minorities in America. Okay? I take that as pretty much indisputable. If you spend any time looking at objective data in medical journals or in sociology or anthropology or, public health, these things are shown over and over again. Jonathan Metzl, by contrast, he says, look, he himself identifies as a white man, and he says, what became curious to me, because he does a lot of stuff in public health, is that whenever he was interviewing people in various states, he himself grew up in the Kansas City area, I believe, Kansas, Missouri, right? He's a professor at Vanderbilt, so down in Nashville, Tennessee. So whenever he looks at the communities that he grew up in and the community that he is a professor in, he started to notice that a lot of policies actually were harming white people as well. And that's something that a lot of people hadn't really talked about too much, or at least to the extent that he developed in this book, Dying of Whiteness. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So tonight, I'm going to try and give a very brief overview of his argument, and then try and talk about kind of what's going on in this book and why it's important to talk about. All right. So the first thing that I should say is that he defines whiteness not as a biological classification. So he doesn't think that it's reducible to a sort of biological category, something like we would use to classify other biological entities. And it's not even a skin color, but it's more a political and an economic system. Okay, political and economic system. Keep that in mind. That theme is going to come up over and over and over again. And in particular, I think this is one of the key distinctions. And if you take away nothing else other than the health stuff, right? It's to really look at this right here. And we need to distinguish between individual and systemic racism, okay? Very often, most people in America, and most people just, talking loosely, whenever a lot of people talk about racism, they think of it as an individual offense, right? Something that's immoral or unjust that a single person does. And you can do this implicitly, as in whenever you bias against people. So there's these implicit association tests. Look up implicit association test, and you can take them very easily, and you can see whether you are implicitly, that is, not consciously, biased toward or away from certain groups, right? Or explicitly. And explicitly is really easy to think, right? We think of using racial slurs or whatever else. So, I mean, this is kind of one of the frustrating replies whenever you're talking about racism in America with people is like, look, uncle or aunt or whatever, that what you just said is racist, right? And a lot of people are like, no, there's no way that what I said was racist. Like, I didn't use racial slurs. And hey, I even have like black friends, or I even have Mexican friends or whatever else. And it's like, oh, okay, maybe, right? Maybe. But scholars, philosophers like me, physicians like Dr. Metzl and other people, very often what scholars are doing is they're trying to talk about systemic problems, okay? These are problems that have to deal with the social policies that we have, structures, maybe the values implicit in our cultures that bias us against racial groups. And this can be either by design or by effect. So by design, right, is something like in American history, it literally used to be legal to own black people, right? That is by design something used to bias against a very specific group of people, right? Women didn't used to be allowed to vote. Same sort of thing. But it's not just by design. We can also look at by effect, right? We can look at statistics of, a population. So in healthcare, health outcomes, what are some quantifiable ways of doing those things? Look at life expectancy. How long are people living? Look at the amount of money per dollar, how much people are spending on something like healthcare, right? These objective things can be analyzed before and after policies, or we can compare ourselves, so I'm an American, right, to comparable countries around the world. Countries like Canada, right? Countries like Germany, which is a fairly large, European country. You can look at various populations and see how policies or certain things affect healthcare outcomes, affect life expectancy, affect, individual reports on how satisfied people feel as though they are with life, right? So racism, it's not reducible to the individual stuff. Naturally, it's not okay to use racial slurs. Naturally, it's not okay to bias against people on an individual level. But what's, I think, very tough for a lot of Americans and a lot of people to wrap their mind around is the idea that, look, you could be a really, really nice person, and you could, in fact, have friends from many different racial, ethnic, socioeconomic backgrounds, whatever else it is. But we could still be racist in the sense that we perpetuate systems and we don't correct them in ways that we should, right? It's kind of like, it's the difference between a game being rigged by the players or a game being rigged by the rules itself. Okay, if there are two teams playing, let's say, a baseball game, right? And, you could look at why a particular team keeps winning over other teams, potentially, right? And let's say that, this isn't talent or anything like that. You could look at individual players. But it turns out that the individual players could just be following the rules. So maybe it's not there. Maybe it's not the individual racism. So then maybe you start to look at the rules. Are the rules to the game messed up such that it's going to bias against certain types of players over others, right? And that's kind of what the systemic stuff is trying to say. It's saying, look, set aside all of this individual stuff. That's important, but let's not, stress that. We've talked about that a lot. Look at the systemic stuff. Because no matter how good you are, if you're playing in a broken system or if you're playing by bad rules, it's going to lead to bad outcomes. And this is especially what Metzel is trying to argue in this particular book, right? And so here's a quote by him. He says, "I began to realize that the overarching negative health effects of these policies resulted not from people's deep biases or fear of minorities lodged deep in their brains, but from specific electoral, economic, and policy decisions made at particular moments in time, right? Crucial. Metzl is not someone who's trying to just make fun of Republicans. A lot of academics are jerks in certain ways, and they bias against Republicans, or they just media can have certain biases in certain way. Metzl is saying, look, I'm not trying to do that. And he goes out into the field and he talks with a lot of people. He says, what I'm most interested in are these people that I talk to all the time. And they don't seem to me to be the kind of people who use racial slurs or who, would do really extreme racially motivated things. However, they do end up voting for policies that end up having ill effects on racial and ethnic minorities and even themselves. So this is the whole idea of dying of whiteness, and we'll sort of get to this. But the crucial distinction is to separate individual offenses, some scholars call this prejudice, right, from systemic stuff, what scholars usually are talking about whenever they're talking about racism, right? And so Metzl makes a lot of observations. Okay? And the structure of his book is basically divided into 3 sections. And he spends a lot of time in different states talking about different aspects, and use each state as a case study for a different aspect. So, for example, he looks at the state of Missouri, and he looks at lots of statistics on gun-related violence, okay? And he especially examines something like suicides. And what he found time and time again is that gun violence was especially high in areas of the country that were rural and had access to guns really, really easily, right? No background check, no gun show sort of regulations, all those types of things. In areas where there are so-called super gun owners that have multiple guns, what he found was that in areas where that's the case, where people owned a lot of guns, perhaps unsurprisingly, suicides, and especially completed suicides that lead to the death of the person who attempted or completed the suicide, right? The completed suicide is really, really high. It's really, really high, right? And he spends a lot of time going to different groups, support, especially for families that have people who died by suicide or by gun violence in the state. And he sort of tries to talk with them, because what he found was that, in these areas, a lot of white and especially rural white voters, they voted for policies that made guns especially easy to procure. And as a result, their communities are suffering by large margins more gun violence, fatalities, and injuries than comparable states, right? So what do we do with that? That's one puzzle. The second puzzle, which he uses in the state of Tennessee, is looking at the healthcare outcomes of lower and middle class Americans, right? And whenever you look at them, they have worse healthcare outcomes in states that don't have state-funded healthcare programs. Tennessee used to have a really successful one, right? But it got phased out. People in Tennessee, and he says explicitly, compared to Kentucky, had way worse healthcare outcomes because their state didn't support, medical resources or public healthcare programs that helped a lot of people, right? And you can literally go state by state and look at how much money states spend on citizens to do things and see what the healthcare outcomes are for people. Are people generally more or less healthy? What is the life expectancy like? How many bankruptcies are there due to medical expenses? And what you find is that white people, rural white people, including and also in addition to racial minorities, they are overwhelmingly on the downside of a lot of policies. who ends up making money off of these things? A lot of people in private medical related fields, lobbyists, those types of things, right? Who are the people that are bearing the brunt of most things? It's people in low and middle classes, people in rural areas, right? That's the puzzle here. Now he's very also open and honest about the fact that, look, healthcare is expensive, all right? There are indeed costs to having something like healthcare, right? But there's also downsides, right? There's also downsides, all right? So whenever he's like trying to talk to these people and figure out why is it the case, as a lower or a middle class person, whenever you look at the data and you see that the healthcare outcomes are actually really, really bad, why would you vote against something like Obamacare? Why would you vote against federal healthcare? Why would you vote against, stronger protections on patients or something like that, right? And he finds here that one of the operative things is that especially white people, in the people that he interviewed, were just more prone to say, look, I don't want to be funding Mexican people. I don't want to be funding black people. I don't want to be funding people who just take advantage of welfare, right? I don't want to be spending more taxes so that certain people can take advantage of the system. There's a certain type of resentment. I think there's a certain type of jealousy and outrage there that certain lower or middle class white people appeal to whenever they vote not to have a state-funded healthcare system. But the effect of that, yeah, sure, maybe it does have really terrible effects on minorities, right? But white people are not exempt from facing really terrible healthcare outcomes in addition to the people that they're trying to prevent from having healthcare, right? And so this is another policy. Why is it the case that, like, if you talk to these people, because this is the sympathetic aspect. This is the aspect. He leads lots of focus groups where, for example, he'll buy people lunch and just ask them questions and have conversations with them. And he'll be like, well, it's the case that, like, in states that have, programs that fund healthcare and that allow people to see doctors more often, preventative healthcare, in places, where people don't go bankrupt from medicine as often, where in places where basic medical services, preventative care is just covered by the state, that things tend to go way better. Why wouldn't you vote for that? Yeah, maybe your taxes go up a little bit, but in comparison to the number of years that you're getting on your life from that, or the quality of life, why wouldn't you do that? Moreover, like, what are the actual costs, right? Who are the people that you're protecting? Now, Metzl doesn't say this, but this is something that I'm deeply perplexed by, right? With a graduated tax system like we have in the U.S., as your income goes higher, the proportion of taxes that you pay tends to go higher. We're not addressing things like write-offs and that kind of stuff. But, like, really, is it so bad that people, for example, who make $300,000 per year pay a higher income tax level if that literally means that more people don't die of preventable illness, right? Or we stay off of the people who make over $300,000 per year and we keep allowing people to die of preventable illness, right? To me, whenever I compare those two things, it doesn't make sense to me why we would protect people who make over $300,000 at the expense of lives whenever we could tax them more, right? And literally save more lives. That's the kind of question that he's interested in, because he admits there are benefits and there are drawbacks to each policy decision. But what white people also maybe aren't paying as much attention to is the ways in which they're included in that, right? And so I think white privilege is used in a couple of the quotes later on in the presentation. But Metzel in interviews has said that white privilege is a very strange idea, because in his research, he's found certainly, look, there are elements of white privilege, okay? I'm not even white, I'm white passing, but because I'm white passing, I don't get hassled by the cops, for example, in the same way. Whenever I speak like this without an accent, right? People listen to me and don't challenge what I say in ways otherwise. Okay, there are elements of privilege that help in certain ways white people or people who are white passing like me. But the sort of odd paradoxical thing is that whiteness also becomes a predictor of worse healthcare outcomes. Okay? Because in deeply white states where you have these economic and policy decisions that align with rural white voters, and not just rural white voters. I keep saying rural because that is something, but it's also just like suburban white people too, right? You see how their healthcare, or you see how the health outcomes are worse off for them, right? So white has privileges, but it also has downsides, and that's what Metzl is trying to get people to see. The last case that he talks about is that of Kansas, okay? And this is the area he grew up in. And he, gives a long, detailed history about how Kansas used to have a really fantastic public school system. So much so that in a place like, Kansas City, Missouri, people would move from the Missouri side to the Kansas side while their children were school age, even if it meant that they had to pay higher taxes because the Kansas schools were so much better. And then a really conservative governor came in, slashed budgets, and really ruined the school systems. Dropout rates increased a ton, right? And you might not think, what does education have to do with healthcare outcomes? Well, there's actually a lot of correlations. And he found, I think it was, there's a rough 9-year correlation between people who graduate high school and people who don't. People who don't graduate high school tend to, on the whole, live like 9 fewer years in their lives, right? Maybe it's 7. But it's many fewer years, right? Why is that the case? Well, it could be a lot of things. A lot of these things are very complex, and he's not trying to reduce it to stuff, but he's trying to say, look, if we're actually worried about health, he's a doctor. And if we're actually worried about people living long lives and living high qualities of lives, we need to look at the policies and the institutions that we create and how they affect them. It's not just a matter of making sure that people eat right. It's not just a matter of making sure that people exercise. Those things are important, right? But it's also a matter of the ways that we form communities. Stress has a huge impact on life, right? Being able to go to a doctor because you're not afraid of the financial burdens that it might pose, that has a huge impact on health. The ways in which we build roads and sewers and infrastructure, right? The ways that we put regulations on industries that can have toxic waste or air quality aspects. Those things affect health, okay? And it's well documented the ways in which those things affect many minorities. So you can look at a city like LA, and you look at the way that the interstates were built historically, and they don't typically go through the rich white neighborhoods, right? They went through the Mexican neighborhoods, they went through the black neighborhoods, that kind of stuff. Where do you place things like landfills? Or where do you allow industries or certain types of commercial stuff to pop up? Again, not in the rich white burbs, right? Those kinds of things are pretty well documented. But even in stuff that's not like that, you can start to look at things just like the education system. How are we funding them? What do the public schools look like? And what are the effects of people's lives? And he says that whenever you look at Kansas, you find how policies can lead to higher, high school dropout rates, and how that can have overarching and pretty dramatic ways of degrading the health of people who live in those states. So a lot of these things that Metzl is talking about are elements of public health. Okay, it's not stuff that's happening inside of a clinic, right? It's not medication. It's not therapy or anything like that. Gun violence, right? State funding. I mean, I guess that is pretty directly related. High school graduation rates. But he's saying, look, whenever you're approaching researching different things and you're actually looking at the data, you can start to see that there are certain things that correlate very quickly. If this goes up, healthcare outcomes goes up. If we put more money into these programs, people tend to live better lives. Or there's inverse correlations, right? We spend less money on these programs, healthcare outcomes go down. So whenever you start to analyze things sort of issue by issue, factor by factor, you start to see that there's things that we don't often pay a lot of attention to that actually impact health quite a lot. So if we're interested, this is why we're studying in a medical ethics class, if we're interested in health, if we're interested in helping people to live healthy lives, long lives, we have to pay attention to these social elements. Okay, these are not Metzel's graphs, but I think that these are similar to the points that he's trying to make, and I think it's fairly striking and pretty easy to see. All right, so the graph on the left is from Business Insider magazine website, and it's gathered from the Journal of American Medicine. The Journal of American Medicine, and basically what it looks at is a range of less healthy to more healthy, okay? And they've intentionally chosen red and blue because it correlates with the political affiliation by state. So on the right-hand side, and this is from Wikipedia, and they, I think, use some public statistics, but it's basically how strong of an affiliation each state has with Republican versus Democrat, right? Where the solidly Democratic states on the right-hand graphic, they are deeply blue. The solidly Republican states are deeply red, right? And then the ones kind of like lighter shades, obviously you can kind of figure that out. But look at the similarities between the left and the right. Okay? The most healthy states, New York, Maine, Oregon, California, Washington, Minnesota. Now look at the political affiliation. California, Oregon, Washington, New York, Maine, Massachusetts, New Jersey, right? What do those have in common? They're Democratic, right? Now, look, I'm not necessarily trying to like say that it's, always going to be the case that Democrats are right on these issues, or it's always the case that Republicans are wrong on the issues. That's not what I'm saying. But what would be the difference between those states that would lead to such a dramatic difference in healthcare or in healthcare outcomes, how healthy people are, or in life expectancy? And then you start to realize that a lot of the contemporary platforms of Democrats, as opposed to contemporary Republicans, is that Democrats want to sink more money into infrastructure. They tend to be more in favor of federal programs to help with healthcare, right? They want better education systems, etc. Okay? It's really important here that you don't think that I'm trying to bash Republicans, okay? Metzl also says, look, liberals make their mistakes too. Liberals make their mistakes. Sometimes they try to go for too much all at once. Sometimes they ignore making the policies palatable or digestible, understandable to the everyday voter. Liberals have problems too. But whenever you look at the data, wherever people are living longer, people are reporting higher life satisfaction, etc. Why is it the case that people tend to do better in Democratic states versus Republican states? For now, right? And he says we need to be really, really careful about this. And I'll get to the conclusion, right? This is the data. He supports it with a ton of statistics. You can read the book and see all the statistics. Now the question is, how do we explain this? How do we explain this? Right? How do we explain this? So he has a few theses, right? And he says, whenever he started to see these things in his fieldwork and talking with people, he said, look, I wanted to learn how people balanced anti-government or pro-gun attitudes while at the same time navigating lives impacted by poor healthcare, widening gun-related morbidity, and underfunded public infrastructures and institutions. So he said, on the one hand, I understand the Republican impulse to say that The government should stay out of things. The government should allow local communities to handle decisions. He's not saying that's a bad idea. There are certain elements of conservative political philosophy that make sense. However, the same communities that take those stances today, also face poor healthcare. Also, by and large, face really terrible gun suicide rates. Another thing that he talks about with guns, people very often will say that they're trying to protect themselves or others with the guns that they purchase or own. But people are way more likely to injure themselves or a loved one with the guns than to even come close to fending off an intruder. What do you do with that, right? What do you do with that? That's just the fact. The fact is, people will say that they're trying to defend themselves and their family, but they're way more likely to hurt themselves or others with the guns that they have in their homes, right? What do we do with that fact? That's just a fact, right? That's just a fact. And that's kind of what he's trying to investigate. That's what he's trying to investigate. And one of the things that he found, especially in the gun control aspect, is that it's incredibly politicized thanks to the NRA and a lot of Republicans, Republican politicians, not necessarily the voters, where they can't even research certain things because they're afraid of getting into political trouble, right? We have this thing where we think about depression like the depressed celebrity sort of thing, where Anthony Bourdain or Chris Farley or just whatever else, right? These people who overdose or commit suicide or whatever else it is. But he says, look, maybe it's worth looking into rural people. Maybe they're elements of depression or things that might influence suicidality or completed suicides. Maybe that's different than the stuff that often gets a lot of play in the media or in the medical journals, right? We need to start studying those things. Maybe it would be useful to depoliticize that so that we can understand what's going on in these communities. He says, moreover, a lot of people actually support something like background checks for gun owners, especially making sure that people, for example, who have domestic violence or assault charges aren't allowed to get, certain types of guns, maybe any gun at all. But that kind of stuff is almost immediately, no pun intended, shot down whenever you're talking with legislators because of the political nature of it. But if we're literally trying to help people live longer and avoid the harm of a lot of these terrible things, what do we do, right? Because we see the communities that are most deeply affected with, for example, gun suicide rates. And we see that they're ones that have the easiest access to guns, and there are a lot of guns there. What do we do with that, right? And is it the case that people who are in these communities, I'm from rural Texas, that we could be wrong about having guns in certain ways being a good thing? Now, notice I said in certain ways. Maybe stuff goes, completed suicide rates go down more if we have something like laws about how you have to store the guns or who's culpable if something happens within the house. Or in other countries, for example, you can store a gun in your house, but maybe you have to store the ammo elsewhere. There are a lot of different ways of regulating something like gun use without taking them away, right? That may have positive impacts. European countries, especially that have a lot of wilderness, they have to have guns, right? Why is it the case that they have fewer suicides or way less gun violence than we do? Those are the kinds of questions that public health people are going to kind of ask, and this is kind of what he's asking. How do we deal with this? How can white people, on the one hand, vote for policies based on these abstract ideological things like freedom or protection or whatever else, right? Where very concretely you can show them statistics that the things that they're voting for are having bad outcomes for the way their lives go. How is that the case, right? One of his major theses is this. When white backlash policies became laws, as in cutting away healthcare programs and infrastructure spending, blocking expansion of healthcare delivery systems, defunding opiate addiction centers, spewing toxins into the air, or enabling guns in public spaces. The result was, and I say this with the support of statistics detailed in the chapters that follow, increasing rates of death. I don't know how more plainly to put this. Right? Metzl isn't trying to guilt people. He's not trying to shame people. He's just trying to say, please just look at the data. Please just look at the data. Because what I find is that there's a lot of ways that people's lives are being cut short or being made much worse off by the policies that they're voting for. Why are we doing this to ourselves? Because again, he identifies as white. He grew up in the Kansas area. Why are we doing this to ourselves, he's going to say. And this is where the name of the book comes from, right? Evermore, white Americans are then literally dying of whiteness. This is because white America's investment in maintaining an imagined place atop a racial hierarchy, that is an investment in a sense of whiteness, ironically harms the aggregate well-being of U.S. whites as a demographic group, thereby making whiteness itself a negative health indicator. So this is him just laying it out, right? If white people are interested in just being who they are, right, and being who they are and living good lives, they need to be really careful, because it turns out that the policies that they're voting for are actually not helping them and actually harming them, right? They're dying of whiteness. They're dying of whiteness. So how do we explain this? Well, one thing that Metzl offers is dogma. What dogma is our sort of beliefs that can't be shaken, beliefs that are not so easily revised, beliefs that maybe we don't have very good evidence for. They're deeply held beliefs, and people just don't want to change them, right? People don't want to change them. Or you can give people a lot of countervailing evidence that tells them that belief probably isn't the best, and that another explanation actually helps explain what they're talking about even better, right? But they don't change it. Okay, that's what dogma is. And he says, look, there are dogma that governmental assistance in any form is evil and not to be trusted, right? We shouldn't trust governmental assistance, even when the assistance came in the form of federal contracts with private health insurance or pharmaceutical companies. So it's not even like the government is you have to go to government-owned hospitals. He's saying there are ways of using government monies to help private companies, right? So the government isn't involved in all of this stuff. It's just funding the things. And he's saying people are still against that. Or, right, dogma against expanded communal safety nets. Or whenever the dogma aligned with beliefs that a racial hierarchy that overtly or implicitly aimed to keep white Americans hovering above Mexicans, welfare queens, and other non-white others. That minority groups receive lavish benefits from the state, even though certain people, he himself, lived and died on a low-income budget with state assistance. How is it that people, white people, can say that government benefits are bad when they themselves actually are the recipient of government benefits? How is it the case, that someone's concept of whiteness or race is actually being used potentially to get them to vote for policies that are against their interest or manipulate them in certain ways? Right? This is kind of what he's talking about. And one of the things that he pins as a problem is dogmatic thinking. We don't allow ourselves to think critically of deeply held beliefs, and we don't just look at the data. Because if you actually look at the data, and look, you also have to try and look at nonpartisan data. There are vested interest groups out there who publish data that actually isn't that good. So you probably, whenever you're looking at these things, need to read multiple studies, or you need to realize that the think tank or whatever else, they have political biases. This is why scholars will read multiple sources. This is why scholars will run things through their own, statistical analyses just to make sure, right? There's a cognitive bias called confirmation bias, and I should have put this in the slides. Confirmation bias that is super crucial to talk about. It's a natural human tendency whenever we're trying to figure stuff out only to look for data that proves us right. Okay? That's similar to the dogmatic attitude. But what scientists, whenever they're doing their job well, what scientists or critical thinkers do well, journalists do well, is they go out and they look for data that could prove them wrong, or they always put their explanation against other explanations and see which one explains the data better, right? That's a hard thing to do. It takes a lot of energy. But that's kind of what you have to do, or else you risk voting for things or making institutions that actually run against your own individual interest. He also offers an explanation from white racial resentment. And he says, look, unspoken or overt claims that particular policies, issues, or decisions served also to tend to defend or restore white privilege or quell threats to idealized notions of white authority represented by demographic or cultural shifts. Okay? What he's arguing for here is trying to get white people to think of the ways in which this idea of whiteness is being used potentially to get them to do things against their own interest. And this is especially ironic with Republicans, considering the ways that, like Republicans have viewed, or working class people have viewed governments in the past, right? There's this weird thing currently, culturally, that's playing out, where on the one hand, Republicans and conservative voters are going to just want to fall in line with whoever the Republican leaders are. But when you look at the history, right, especially in this area, Kentucky, Tennessee, etc., where people used to run from the cops across state lines because they were selling moonshine, right, to try and support their families. Prohibition, that sort of stuff. There were times whenever Republicans and working class people didn't defend corporations or profit, right? Because working in coal mines or working in industrial settings, literally children were dying inside of the factories. Or literally, they did armed rebellions against corporations to try and make sure that they had an okay quality of life, right? There was a deep sense of solidarity with the working class and with unionization that used to be a part of the working class, and it still is in certain industries, still is in certain areas, right? And that's kind of like what happened to that? How did people move from that to just falling in line whenever certain people bring up whiteness or whatever else, an ability to be proud of one's race, etc.? The idea here is that we have to be very, very careful about elements of our identity. That is, things that we identify with, things that we take very, very close to heart, that we find meaningful, things that we find, if we didn't have that, we would be someone completely different, right? Those core things, we need to be very, very careful and critical and instrumental in the development of those ideas, because they can be used to harm us just as much as they can help us, right? Politicians very frequently will talk to demographics about aspects of identity, especially in white politics, about how that can be okay, right? Metzl says, look, I don't want white people to just apologize for being white. Why would that? Doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to ask someone to apologize for who they are. But what I do want white people to do is to take some time and to think about what whiteness means and what it may or may not be doing in ways of getting you to vote one way or the other. Okay? And I'll return to this point right here on this slide. So what are the conclusions? Well, he says, look, brains, genetics, feelings, and attitudes make racial hierarchy feel impossible to address because they suggest that people are and will always be the same, but decisions are communally made and can thus be communally unmade and remade in better ways. And I'm just going to read through these so that we can get to the last slide. Metzel also says, we lose perspective when we explain racially charged encounters in the United States solely on the basis of what exists in people's minds or on their individual actions. Doing so blocks recognition of the ways racial anxieties manifest themselves in laws, policies, and infrastructures, in the ways that carry negative implications for everyone. Again, he says, we usually define morality as linked to biology, genetics, fate, accident, or illness. Or we think about death from unwanted intruders, pathogens that invaded through the water or the air. Yet the kinds of data I've tracked in this book raise the specter that American human frailty is in part man-made, rendered all the more tenuous not by invasions of them, the immigrants or the pathogens, but by political choices made by us, the white electorate. So this is a self-critical thing. Again, Metzl identifies as white. He's talking to himself as much as he's talking to people, who might be different, right? Different than himself. Because, right, he's a professor at Vanderbilt. He's making a lot of money. He lives in the city, right? But he grew up in the Kansas, Missouri area. And he treats a lot of patients in really rural parts of Tennessee. He's asking for people to be critical about these really deeply held elements, okay? So what are the problems? What are the sort of solutions that come up? Well, one of the problems is the medicalization or the over-individualization of problems. What does that mean? Well, whenever we're looking at healthcare, we can try to just use medicalized terms. We can try to talk about blood pressure. We can try to talk about blood sugar levels. We can try to talk about, labs, certain hormones or whatever. We can talk about body mass index, whatever else. Or we can look at, how are you eating? How are you exercising, etc. That stuff plays a role, right? It's not like that doesn't play a role. But if we do too much of that, we forget to do part of the solution, which is to look at the social factors, right? One element of helping people, for example, with mental health, anxiety, and depression is making sure that the state has safety nets that makes being poor way less anxiety inducing. If you know that you're going to be able to eat, if you know that you're going to be able to pay rent, your mental health is probably going to improve more than if you didn't. If there are programs out there for people who suffer from opiate addiction, opiates aren't going to be as big of a problem in states that support that sort of thing. If states don't criminalize nonviolent drug offenses, then people feel more comfortable in seeking help for those things, right? We don't often think about these political things as having overt healthcare outcomes, but they do. Think about the things that, that affect health, whether it's cardiac health, even the function of your immune system, whatever else it is. And you find that social stressors or social factors or the support systems that we put in place have really, really huge things. And so we can use medical, clinical type stuff, diagnoses. We can talk about the agency that we have in all of these things. We are powerful. We can control a lot of things, but we can't neglect the social factors. If we're actually interested in public health and making sure that people live well, we have to look at the social stuff. Okay? What's another potential problem? Dog whistle politics and single issue voters. What does that mean? Well, sometimes you can signal what party you're a part of by using certain language, or you can use a single issue like abortion is a really great one to try and rally a base to vote for a particular candidate, right? But that might not actually be the best way of dealing with stuff. And he says, one of the things that we need to do is we need to look at what's important and we need to demand more from our leaders across the political spectrum. Okay? And he says, especially when it comes to social infrastructure. Okay? And he says, look, there's this possibility of being a conservative and a progressive at the same time, or a progressive Republican. Right? How is that the case? Well, look, there are things that society just needs to function well. We need roads, right? We need functioning water and electricity. Look at what happened in Texas with the big freeze. Literally, they privatized their grid. The owners of the grid didn't prepare it for inclement weather, and they basically had been misusing funds in a lot of ways, and it basically collapsed, right? What if the government made sure that the grid and everything like that was actually taken care of? That seems to go across the aisle, right? Schools. There is basically no downside to having an educated populace, right? For me, I think a very clear issue is something like community colleges, okay? There's a lot of talk about canceling student loan debt. There's a lot of talk about making colleges free. But I think like something like making community colleges free, to me, is something that makes a lot of sense to me in America, because we have a lot of money, and we can tax corporations and close loopholes and stuff like that. Because what if you go to a community college, it's not, they're not just teaching, like I'm a philosophy professor, right? Maybe they teach a couple of philosophy classes, probably not all that many. But community colleges are also teaching things like welding, right? Teaching things like carpentry, teaching things like the softwares that you use to draft things, right? They're teaching all sorts of certifications, like learning to be a truck driver. There are so many things that community colleges and directly investing in an educated populace can do to improve stuff. In fact, Metzl talks about Kansas asking to get a new Amazon headquarters. And one of the reasons that Amazon passed over Kansas is that they didn't have an educated enough populace for the industries that Amazon needed to use. Right? Education, infrastructure, libraries, parks, safety nets, right? All of these things help Republicans and Democrats alike. And he's saying, let's insist on looking at the things that actually impact health. Look at the statistics that actually impact how long we live, that impact how good we feel about living the lives that we live, that make our communities stronger, that make our communities come together. Let's look at those things and let's demand that our leaders give those things. Let's not let them play us by single issues like abortion, or by single issues like, so with the liberals this last election, at least they're not Trump, right? Because whenever we reduce things to single issues, we do not get close to the stuff that's actually impacting health and impacting our qualities of life. So that's what he's saying. Be careful, be critical, right? And this just generally, and this is the last sort of thing, is basically saying, look, we can overestimate our own intelligence. So I phrased this one a little weird. We can overestimate our own intelligence and our own independence. The problem is, a lot of times we think that we understand how the world works, or we think that we're just kind of like independent, but that's not the thing. That's not the thing. We are all tied together, right? Look at the pandemic. The pandemic is such a strange thing to combat for Americans, because we do not take care of our most vulnerable populations in ways that we should, right? I remember reading news sources saying that certain states were allowing homeless people to get vaccinated and others weren't. Maybe this was my mistake. I shouldn't have read the comments section, but a lot of people were just talking about really terrible things. I don't even think I should repeat the really awful things that I read in the comment section. But look, if we want to solve the pandemic in a city, we need a lot of people to buy in to public health concerns. You can't just treat people who hang out in the suburbs and think that's going to treat things. Because people in the suburbs don't just hang out with people in the suburbs, right? They come into the city. We have lots of interactions with lots of different people. We are all mutually dependent on each other. And we can't assume that we just know how the world works. So how do we solve this? Well, look, we need to admit to our own interdependence. We need to admit to our own vulnerability, and we need to admit to our own gullibility. Okay? This goes back to that confirmation bias point. We all just sort of naturally will gravitate toward the points that confirm what we already believe. We all just naturally will go toward the ideas that don't press on sore spots in us and don't show how interdependent we are or how vulnerable we are in certain situations. Okay? But we all depend on one another, right? And so like I think there's an element here, and I think Aristotle captures this really well whenever he's talking about elements of justice and elements of generosity, which is like, look, obviously he wasn't American. He's not talking about a Democrat or Republican. He's saying part of what makes good people good is that if they have more than they need, right, or if they have more than others, and they see others suffering, right, they're going to feel bad about that, and they're going to do what they can to help other people. And look, if you're Republican, that can mean giving direct help, maybe through charity or church or whatever else, right? Volunteering your time as a doctor or whatever else it is. If you're a Democrat, that can mean supporting certain policies, etc. But the point is, if we want for our communities to flourish, if we want for everyone to enjoy good health, good qualities of life, we need to become more active, right? Naturally, the burden doesn't fall on all people the same, okay? You're college students, right? You're 18 to 22. You're just barely sort of getting started in life. You're at a giant state school, right? This message hits different to people who have more money or have more power. But it does say that we need to be careful not to just think that we're independent or that we can control everything ourselves, or even people with college degrees or, really great specialization in one area, that we can't in fact learn more by studying the data critically. Okay? And I think that's what Metzl's book is overall trying to get us to do, right? If we want to look at health, let's start looking at things much more broadly than what happens in hospitals or clinics. Let's look at all of the broad facets of life that actually contribute to good or bad outcomes in people's lives, right? And let's demand more of our politicians and our leaders to make sure that we are investing in social infrastructure. We all need roads. We need electricity. We need water, right? We need schools. We need parks. It would be nice if people didn't go bankrupt just for seeking medical care. If we care about health, which I assume this is kind of one of the things that we're dealing with in medical ethics, we need to look at these public things and consider the overall context of what makes people healthy and what makes people's lives go better, right? And again, this is not a singular party issue. Whether you think you need to do that privately, right, and do that through charity and do that through local community organization, fine, do that. Whether you think that needs to be done on a larger scale with, organizations, reforming policies, etc., fine, do that. But the point is that whenever we're considering something like health, we need to really delve into the data, to be critical about stuff, and to be especially critical the closer it is to elements of who we are. Race, gender, ethnicity, etc. All of that stuff, it's really important to us. We need to subject it to a bit of criticism, seeing where our ideas lie and what impact it's having on our lives. Because as Metzl is going to say, whiteness as an idea, as an economic and social concept, it can get people to vote against their own interests, right? And it's not that people are, dumb or anything like that for doing those things. He says explicitly that's not the case. But he's saying we need to talk more with one another and we just need to be critical, right? So he says, the white electorate basically needs to do better. All right. So, I'm interested to hear. Yeah, what did you think of Metzl's book? What do you think of these conclusions? What do you think of the examples that he brings up? What do we take? How do we explain the data? Right? If we go back to the maps, let me see if I can find the maps really quickly. How do we explain that? How do we explain that? What do we do with that? Right? That's the Metzl question. What do we do with that? He presents the data. He's saying this is a public health concerns. As a physician, the political solutions are sort of up to us. And what I'm trying to get us to think critically in medical ethics is the ways in which health isn't just something constrained to the hospital or the clinic, but it comes down to the ways in which we build our communities. And one of the fundamental things that we can ask whenever we're building our communities is, do we want people in Kentucky? Do we want people in the United States to have access to certain resources just because we are the kind of people who want certain services to be done? Just because you're American, I want to make sure that you have adequate access to healthcare. Just because you're American, I want to make sure that you have access to education. Are there costs? Absolutely. Absolutely. But if the cost is literally taxing people who make hundreds of thousands of dollars per year so that people can live better lives, right? Is that appropriate? Right? Is that appropriate? And that's what I want us to reflect on. So thank you so much for your attention. I will see y'all next time.